9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Deep State Radio. This is David Rothkopf, the host of the not-so-special episodes. What makes this one special is our guests, two of the smartest people we know on all issues nuclear. Joe Cirincione. How are you doing, Joe?
Just great, David, all things considered.
All things considered. And our friend Jon Wolfsthal. How are you doing, John?
As they famously say, ditto.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I remember when everything was going well in the world, and I was afraid of asking John how things were going. So, now that things are going really off the tracks, it's unnerving. I thought about having this conversation with you because in the past few days, as the world has come to grips with the fact that the policy of the Trump administration is not just an adjustment on Joe Biden. It's not just to, for example, change our quote policy with regard to Ukraine, but it's a strategic realignment of the United States to become effectively an ally of Russia and to become effectively an adversary of our traditional allies in NATO. And that there is a whole pattern of behavior that is not just the crazy meeting that took place in the Oval Office on Friday that supports this, whether it's standing down cyber operations against Russia or standing down operations that track crimes by Russian oligarchs or standing down the Department and the Department of Homeland Security that protected us against foreign interference in our elections, or it is putting a Russia propagandist and head of the intelligence community, or it's having the Secretary of Defense stand up and say NATO is essentially on its own, they can't count on us, or it's Trump saying, I want to have Russia back in the G8, or Marco Rubio saying there are all these deals we can cut, or Trump creating a program of gold cards for the United States when asked if this would be an invitation for Russian oligarchs. His response was, well, I know there are a lot of Russian oligarchs who are pretty nice guys. I don't have the time to list them all. In area after area after area, we've shifted our policies, not just a little bit, but dramatically. And I think we're dealing with the emotional effect of this, but it's got a substantive effect. And so, for example, on a podcast we did on Friday with Doug Lute and Mark Polymeropoulos and Rosa Brooks, one of the things we talked about was what the impact of this might be on Five Eyes, on intelligence sharing. Because clearly our former intelligence partners are not going to trust the same information, particularly about Russia, to the United States. But I think a bigger and in many respects more troubling implication of all of this is what it might mean strategically, and particularly with regard to nuclear weapons. Because throughout your careers, distinguished careers in both of your parts, one of the sort of fundamental assumptions with regard to strategic affairs between our countries and frankly in the world was that the country with the largest nuclear arsenal, which was Russia, and the country with the second largest, which was the United States, were going to be rivals in opposition to one another, that there was some balance at the core of this system. And clearly, if that's not the case, it changes everything and it raises questions. If you were counting on the United States to be your nuclear shield, can you count on it anymore? Should you have your own nuclear capabilities? Should some countries that aren't in the club seek to join the club, et cetera? And so I just wanted to turn to you guys, and I turn to you first, Joe, and then to you, John, and get your reaction to this shift.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having us on. And that I listened to that podcast on Friday. It was excellent. I think it was the single best discussion I heard of the consequences of this and the profound structural changes that will result from what Trump is doing. And it wasn't just what he did on Friday at the White House. It's what he's been doing from day one of his administration, just as you outlined. Every step he's taken has been beneficial to Putin and detrimental to the national security of the United States. And what that means is that you can't take these steps. You can't have this shift. You can't switch sides, as you discussed on Friday, and still maintain the basic institutions and frameworks that we created after World War II and have continued for some 80 years. And part of those frameworks are the frameworks that have prevented the spread of nuclear weapons around the world, which is why what Trump is doing is so dangerous. For that, perhaps certainly one of our greatest threats, the possibility that more countries will get nuclear weapons, thus increasing the chances that somebody will use nuclear weapons, and those will escalate to a global nuclear conflict. Let me just say briefly what that means. And I was struck by this when I saw Tim Snyder's writings last week, where he talked about the consequences in this. And he said, should Russia be allowed to prevail? Should Ukraine be defeated, then nuclear weapons will spread around the world, both to those who wish to bluff with them, the way Putin has done in the Ukraine war, and those who will need them to resist the bluff. And I think that's exactly right. In Europe, for over 7 decades now, there have been two basic frameworks that have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in Europe. One is NATO, which was started in 1949, so celebrated its 75th birthday last year. And that provided positive security assurances to our European allies. It said, if you are attacked, we, the United States, will defend you, and we will defend you with our nuclear weapons. So you don't need to get your own nuclear weapons. We'll protect you from the then Soviet nuclear threat. But that by itself wasn't enough to stop other countries from considering getting their nuclear weapons. After NATO was formed, the United Kingdom got nuclear weapons in 1952. France did a test in 1960, despite the security assurances. You needed this other framework, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which only came into effect in the end of the 1960s, negotiated in 68, ratified by Richard Nixon in 1970. And that provided the diplomatic and legal framework that said, if you choose not to get nuclear weapons, you're part of the international norm. This is what the world is doing now. Those countries with nuclear weapons will negotiate their reduction and elimination, and those without them will promise not to get them. So that gave countries the assurances that if they didn't get nuclear weapons, their neighbors wouldn't either. So a country like Sweden, for example, that had a nuclear program, wasn't part of NATO, had a nuclear program, only gave it up in 1968 after the NPT was negotiated. Those two basic frameworks are now at risk, are now in doubt. NATO clearly, and I would say the entire non-proliferation regime and U.S. commitments to these kinds of frameworks, that's coming. That's one of the other dominoes that will fall. All that framework crumbles. All that puts countries' nuclear choices, up again in the same kind of debates. We're going to see the same kind of debates in European countries and Asian countries that we saw in the 1950s and 60s. Should we go nuclear or not?
Thank you. John, what's your reaction?
So I agree with the assessment that what Trump is doing is not about incrementalism. He has decided to throw in, as part of the network of autocratic revisionist states around the world, Russia, Hungary, Argentina. This isn't just sort of a tactical shift. This is about a new alliance among corrupt despots. And so Putin is naturally in that. I think, is really interesting question whether, I think Trump is sort of feeling out whether he can sort of work something out with Xi. But on a strategic and a nuclear landscape, for me, it boils down to something pretty simple. I've been in the White House. I've studied nuclear history for my entire life. At multiple times, the United States could say to friends and allies, don't build nuclear weapons. You don't have to. We have them. We have the best conventional capabilities in the world, or at least we can blunt an adversary. And if things go poorly, we can come over the top with nuclear. And our allies said, we need to have confidence in your capabilities, and we need to have confidence in your credibility. For deterrence to work, for assurances to work, for nonproliferation to work, you need to have both. And Trump is throwing both away, quite frankly. The credibility of the United States is no longer there. I couldn't to an ally say, don't worry, we'll be there to defend you in NATO, in South Korea, Japan. And so when they come to me, and they do, and saying, what should we do with our own defense capabilities? I was like, I think you need to find other friends and allies to work with over the near term. And you have to keep your security options open over the long term. That's not to the advantage of the United States, because we suffer anytime a country gets nuclear weapons. That's another country that could use them to entangle us in a conflict. Something happens around the world, it affects us, despite what Trump may want to do on tariffs and sanctions and isolation. We're the global country. That's a country that can lose control over those nuclear weapons. And gee, there are lots of groups out there who'd like to get their hands on a weapon and use it against the United States or our interests. That's a country that could turn around and blackmail the United States. So there's just no positive benefit that comes from the spread of these weapons. And of course, if we're going to devolve into a balance of power again, like we did between World War I and World War II, but with multiple countries trying to balance each other with both nuclear and conventional capabilities, we're going to have a war. We're going to have a conflict. There's a country that's going to miscalculate. My greatest fears are not about what Iran might do in 5 years or 10 years. It's what's Putin or Xi going to do in 2026, 2027. As Trump window, assuming he doesn't live forever and doesn't remain in power forever, begins to close, is that the time they want to seize territory? And do they miscalculate? Do American former allies come to the defense of those countries? And does that rapidly escalate? So I think you're right to be concerned. I think you're right to say that this is about a major strategic change. What I don't understand is I understand what's in it personally for Trump, both in terms of animus and ego. I don't understand where the Republican caucus in Congress thinks that this is in their personal interest, political interest, or strategic interest. So when Graham comes out and says, yeah, he really stuck it to Zelensky, and when Rubio, the former, sort of serious person of the Republican Party, sits there with, sort of a dead-eye stare and then defends Trump on the weekends, it's very hard for me to figure out how these pieces fit together.
I think the concept that you just outlined of the sort of Trump window of danger is something that people really need to think about. This guy is in his late 70s and not in great health, and creates an opportunity for our former adversaries, who are now in some way our allies, or at least of this government. They don't know what's going to happen after him. So strike while the iron is hot, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, Putin has been very clear for 25 years what his ambition is. It's to destroy the credibility of the United States and push them as far off the European continent as possible. And what better way to do that? He's been after Georgia, after Ukraine. The best way to put a nail in the American coffin in Europe is to seize NATO territory and dare the United States to do something about it. And he doesn't have to do it next week or next year, but I fully expect him to start making claims on Baltic territories, as he's indicated historically that there are Russian-speaking. I mean, this is the play he had on Ukraine. There are Russian-speaking populations there. They deserve to be protected by the Russian state. This is Russian territory anyway. These lines are artificial, so we're going to step in, and she will make the same argument on Taiwan.
No. Yeah, and by the way, I share your concerns about the Russian state, about the Baltics, but look for aggressive action in Moldova first. Look for some in Georgia also to solidify their hold there, even before that. But let me shift this a little bit, given our time constraints here, Joe. What are you hearing about the plans of the Trump-Hegseth administration regarding their nukes? Like, what are they going to do over the course of the next couple months that we've got to look out for, because it's going to be a sign that things are shifting even further?
Sure. There's two things. One is the sort of the verbal fog machine that's Donald Trump, and he puts down these statements of, what do we need so many nuclear weapons for? Shouldn't we be? I want to negotiate with Putin. Let's work to eliminate these weapons, and that sends us all scurrying off in one direction. The other is what they're actually doing, and what they're doing in the Pentagon is a budget scrub. They want to get 8% reduction in current programs, not for savings, but to shift those over to Trump's priorities. What are those priorities? Well, what he's outlined so far is revive Star Wars, revive the Reagan shield that we'd build around the country, an Iron Dome for America. That's going to cost a whole lot of money. It won't work, but in the pursuit of a machine that won't work, we're going to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars. He wants some of that. New nuclear weapons. Project 2025 calls for accelerating all our nuclear weapons programs and in adding more to what's already in the pipeline. So that's one thing you're seeing. The second thing I think what you're seeing is the axe that's about to come on the State Department. The Trump administration, in pursuit of his alliance with Putin, has already cut off a major arm of U.S. influence around the world, USAID. That is our foreign assistance. Countries have problems. They need money. We give them money for their aid programs, and therefore these countries then have good relations with us. Economic aid is a huge asset for the United States. He's now ended that. We're gone with that. The other asset is U.S. global diplomacy around the world, leadership in things like nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear disarmament, arms control talks. They are going to axe that bureau from the State Department. I'm convinced that that's going to be one of the first to go. They're looking for massive reductions in the State Department diplomatic arm. So while they're increasing, some of the military programs Trump wants, they're decreasing these other elements of U.S. assistance. That fits with an authoritarian agenda. That's what I expect to come. These dominoes are going to keep falling. So what we've seen so far is just the beginning of a radical restructuring of American strategic relationships and American strategic power around the world.
Yeah, and John, that runs directly contrary to Trump's talk about peace, because essentially what you're doing is you're saying, here are all the tools we have to resolve things peacefully, and we're going to eliminate them, which is only going to, in crisis, leaves you with the things that can be resolved through conflict. But I'm interested in your response to the same question.
Yeah, I mean, but remember, Trump has said very clear, only I can make peace. He doesn't need these underlings, right? He was going to negotiate with Kim Jong-un and met with him twice. Couldn't get a deal done because he actually doesn't know the details, and you actually need people to negotiate and verify. And same thing with Russia. He wanted to sit down and negotiate with Russia and China on nuclear cuts in his first term. Couldn't even get China to the table because he can't organize his administration. So even if there's agreement at the top, okay, let's limit these things, he doesn't actually have control over all the pieces of government, and he's trying to fire those people that could help him, right? Remember, he just fired and then had to rapidly rehire the people that keep America's nuclear weapons from exploding when they're not supposed to explode, and preventing radiological materials from leaking into the groundwater and keep them contained. Oops, Elon Musk broke a couple of eggs because he had to make an omelet, but he's doing that to the State Department as well. All of those people and experts, and in the military. Even if those people weren't being fired, everybody I know is getting their resume ready. Why would they want to stay in an administration where they know they're not going to be valued and probably going to get axed? So for Trump, that's fine, but it means he can't get from here to there when it comes to negotiating cuts. When they say peace, and David, you know this better than I do. When they say peace, they don't mean principled negotiated security. They mean surrender, right? When they go to Zelensky, why don't you want peace? They're like, why don't you just roll over? So for Trump, that means, okay, well, you want a couple of chunks of Europe, that doesn't bother us. We don't get that much from, okay, Latvia won an Academy Award, but beyond that, what do we need them for? Taiwan, China's still going to want to sell us chips. Sure, there'll be coding on it and they'll be able to listen to everything we do, but as long as we can still get our cars and our phones, what do we care whether it's Taiwan or China? Of course, we should care, but Trump doesn't. And so that realignment and that expansion of Chinese and Russian power and that contraction of American influence, How that factors into nuclear to me still remains unclear. You opened with this. Russia has about 5,000 nuclear weapons. We have about 3,700. If Russia's Trump's friend, why do we have that many weapons? I don't actually support getting rid of them and just sort of rolling over to Russia. I believe in global nuclear elimination, negotiated, verified, and enforced. But if Trump says, well, these guys are our friends and we don't need to worry about them, then you could cut massive parts of the U.S. nuclear budget. And according to him, we'd be fine. That doesn't mean we'd be fine, but I worry that's where we could end up very quickly.
Yeah, and of course, Elon Musk doesn't know any of this, and he's leading the charge on cuts. And then there is some additional component of this, which just strikes me as I listen to both of you guys, which doesn't get covered in the press very much because it's a little awkward. But a lot of their policy is founded on complete bullshit. And like their science and vax policy, like the deal that Trump saw as his path to a Nobel Peace Prize in Ukraine was we were going to get access to their rare earth metals.
Yeah.
They don't have rare earth metals. It's just bullshit. We don't know if they do, and if they do, they're probably in Russian-controlled territory. Joe, you've written about this, and I think quite compellingly. Trump's idea is, well, we're going to have an iron dome, which, by the way, in his mind means we don't need to have troops everywhere, and so we'll be protected like the Israelis were. And as you've compellingly said, that's complete bullshit. It doesn't work. We can't actually do that. But in the remaining 7 minutes we've got here, let me ask you another question that goes back to the intel issue, because of course,
right.
The critical element of a nuclear deterrent is not actually using the nukes. It's maintaining the threat and understanding the threats of others and finding other non-nuclear ways to respond to those threats once they've been identified. So the most sensitive element of U.S. intel has been nuclear intelligence, strategic intelligence. Where are their nukes? Where are their factories? How are they building? And so on and so forth. And among the Five Eyes partners, sharing that has been absolutely essential. How can that continue in this world?
Well, as you said on the podcast on Friday, it can't. If you're a member of the Five Eyes, so Australia or Canada, the UK, and you're being asked to provide intelligence information to Tulsi Gabbard, are you going to want to expose your agents, some of which may be inside Russia, providing this information? We've had excellent intelligence on what Putin intended to do with Ukraine. You remember the warnings before the war? Well, where do you think you get that? You don't get that from just intercepting signals. You have to have people inside willing to talk to you. Well, Putin would really like to know who those people are. And if you're one of the members of Five Eyes, are you going to share that information with Tulsi Gabbard or Pete Hegseth? I wouldn't. I would say that cooperation is all but dead. It's at best highly limited right now in the kind of data our allies are going to be willing to give us.
John, this is why I really wanted to have this conversation, because all the focus of the media on Friday was on the shouting and the awkwardness and why wasn't Zelensky wearing a suit?
It was good TV. It was good TV, David.
Well, exactly as Trump said, it was good TV. But there's so much more than that going on here in this shift in this past month, and I'm just wondering about your answer to the same question about intel.
So I would broaden it and say, David, I've been wrong in thinking about this problem during the transition period, which is, well, we've lived with 4 years of Trump before. We've lived with periods of disruption. Joe and I worked together when George W. Bush was president and had regime change as the organizing principle. And we're like, okay, we'll build back after that. How do you build back when the operating secrets for our submarines have been turned over to the Russians or the Chinese, and our agents have been exposed and killed? When the experts that actually know how to maintain nuclear weapons, keep them safe, dismantle them, build new ones have been fired. When the people that have been working with countries, not just allies or friends, even potential adversaries, to keep them from falling into chaos and their nuclear weapons spreading. When those people are gone and you do have chaos, um, all of those things can't be rebuilt on January 20th, 2029. That's not the way this works. This is not about a realignment. This is about a destruction of what has made America safe, secure, and prosperous in the interests of, and I don't, I think this isn't really coming as much from Trump as much as Musk, and just in the interest of disruption. Destroy it all. It'll be built back in a better form. That's the mentality that he and many of the people in his orbit have brought with them. And even when then people said, okay, I have to justify my job in two sentences. I keep American nuclear weapons from exploding when they're not supposed to. Their AI algorithm didn't understand that, and those people got fired anyway. And so all of that is not just being disruptive or sort of temporarily turned off. It's being burnt to the ground. And building that back is something that I don't know, because I don't know what's going to happen after Trump in terms of the next president. How we build that back?
And just 30 seconds to add to that. We're not guessing about this. This is what the Europeans are saying. The man who's most likely to be Chancellor of Germany next, Friedrich Merz, who just won the election, said that his highest priority was to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible. Why? To achieve true independence from the United States. Germany, true independence from the United States. This is a shocking statement that has never been made by any German. And this is a very conservative German politician. And the Europeans are already talking. The president of France has said, well, maybe France could, which it has about 290 nuclear weapons, it could provide a nuclear deterrent, a European nuclear deterrent. So these conversations are already happening. They understand that Europe cannot depend on the United States anymore, and they have to have their true European security independence, including nuclear.
So important, so well said. You guys are such essential voices. I really hope everybody listening to this will go and follow Joe and Jon in all of their work. This is a critical discussion. It's not happening. And as they have laid out, not only have we switched our strategic alignment in the world in a profound way, but the risks in the near term are great. The risks in the medium to long term are great. And there are a lot of warning signs we should be looking for about stress and breakdown within our alliances, within our own defenses, within our own leadership, that can make this very dangerous situation even more dangerous. And it's just not something that most people in the security community have factored into their calculations over the course of the past several decades. Nobody said, oh, what happens if the U.S. switches sides?
Right.
And that's where we are right now, folks. Right. So I really hope you guys will come back. We can continue this conversation on a regular basis. I admire both you a lot, and I'm glad you're my friends. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with more on this each and every day, and more deep dives on this in the not too distant future. Until then, bye-bye.